Hello, everyone. I'm Betsy Alice, and I'm a member of UU's for a Just Economic Community. We're that small, feisty group that has been working actively for economic justice for well over a decade. Michael Parenti represents a long list of very distinguished and amazing thinkers and activists that we have brought to GA year after year. Michael Parenti is an historian and social scientist. Parenti, the author of 18 books about social and political issues. His 19th book, called Super Patriotism, is about to come out within the next month. Some of the books are, you probably know about Democracy for the Few and To Kill a Nation. Michael is the author of those books. He knows history and he knows democracy. And he's been worried about our democracy for the few for a long time, and writing and explaining the underlying structures that have contributed to the erosion of our democracy. His latest book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, which is going to be out there for sale, was nominated last fall for a Pulitzer Prize. This book tells the compelling story of popular resistance against entrenched power, wealth, and corruption during the late Roman Republic. Sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Today, he will bring lessons from history from that time to our current global economy and how citizens and governments alike can help shape a more sustainable world. We are very honored to bring this distinguished writer and thinker to you. Let's give a warm welcome to Michael.
Thank you. I want to thank the Unitarian Universalists for a Just Economic Community for bringing me here today. Those of you who are planning to ask me at the end of this talk, yes, but what do we do about it? Then let me say right now, come work for the Unitarian Universalists for Just Economic Community. It's an organization that fights against economic injustice and for all forms of social justice. They educate, they engage and activate people. Both Unitarian Universalists and even others have been known to be activated by them. And I would encourage you to get involved by joining and by making a contribution. What I'm going to talk about a subject that really, I'm not going to talk about, there's been some confusion. I couldn't find out what my talk was supposed to be today. I finally just heard what it's supposed to be. But what I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to talk about a subject that really consumes many people. It's the central organizing passion of their life. It's an intoxicant. It's something that's more important than anything else. They will kill for it. I'm going to talk about wealth. And I'm going to talk about class. Now, class, you usually can't, on the left, the American left, you can't talk about class. You can talk about class like upper middle, upper, lower, a status, a group, an income level, and that sort of thing. What you can't talk about is class as a dynamic, class as a relationship to class power and social power. That's what I want to talk about, class and wealth. Well, what is wealth? What is wealth? I mean, we're all interested in it, so where does it come from and what is it? Wealth has two basic sources, that's aside from its culturally defined dimensions. First, there's the natural resources of the planet, of the environment. That's the great basic source of wealth. The land, the fruits of the land and the forests, the subterranean resources, the mineral deposits and other rich deposits, the resources from the sea, salt, fish, kelp, the sun's energy. These are all sources, if harnessed and gathered, that become wealth. The second source is human labor. There's really no natural resource that automatically leaps into our mouths, certainly none that automatically leaps into our wallets or pockets. Even food gathering in a very lush, fertile community requires labor, the labor of gathering. Labor, then, is the vital other ingredient. And labor adds use value to resources, making them accessible, making them consumable, and therefore making them marketable. Labor also adds market value. It transforms, for instance, what transforms a useless tree, and a tree is useless. I mean, a tree can be precious, it's beautiful, it's part of our survival, our health and environment, but for the market, it's useless, unless it's on a property that enhances the value of the property. Someone sells you this and says, look, you got this beautiful oak tree here too, you know. Oh yeah, we added $1,000 to the house just for that tree. But generally, what transforms a useless tree into a commodity that you can sell is the labor that goes into harvesting it, transporting it into lumber. Now, lumber itself is another marketable commodity, of course. That's a source of profit. And then transforming that lumber into furniture, all the labor that goes into that, and all the labor that goes into advertising and selling it and transporting it and bringing it to your house. Where do you want it, lady? And putting it down. All of that makes this, is what gives value to that tree. It's the labor. In food gathering and hunting and even early horticultural societies, there was not much opportunity to accumulate wealth. I mean, if you were a Native American Indian, you might want to own 2, 3 horses. You might even have pride, but you couldn't own 200. You couldn't take care of them all. You wouldn't have any reason for that. There was a rough equality of life in early food gathering and horticultural societies. There was a place for everybody at the fireplace. There was a communal table. If there was abundance, it was shared by all, more or less. I mean, maybe the hunter who killed the buffalo got the first choice cut or something, but everybody, there was food pretty much for everybody. If there was scarcity, if the herds disappeared, if the crops failed, if there was hunger, that too was shared by all. This is what was called primitive communism by some. By late horticultural societies, by the time you develop agriculture and surpluses and such, larger tracts of land are cultivated, towns and settlements, larger concentrations of populations in abundant valleys, trade develops, and wealth accumulates. And we witness a very strange and unfortunate phenomenon. That is, those with a surplus abundance, instead of sharing, become more possessive. Surplus and accumulation stimulates the accumulation impulse. Those with large tracts of land and large herds want still larger tracts and larger herds. And to make sure they can keep them, they hire bands of retainers to protect what they have from the dispossessed, the beginnings of the state and the beginnings of class society. So in advanced horticultural societies, they also do something else. They use force and violence to enlist other people into the quotidian drudgery, into the toil of their plantations, their estates, their mines, and such. These other people are slaves. And the slaves create wealth through their labor by creating all of this stuff and consuming but a bare subsistence of it. Well, so class society, class conflict, these are, as I say, they're forbidden terms in U.S. political culture, even among many who pretend to be on the left. You're not going to hear too much of that. But thinking of class as more than just a sociological category or an income category, as I said, lower middle, upper middle, all that stuff, thinking of class as a dynamic interrelationship having to do with wealth Class, in that sense, is not just a category or a status, it's a social relationship. There's no such thing as a class in isolation. You can't talk about slaves without talking about slave holders and masters. You can't talk about lords without talking about vassals and serfs. You can't talk about corporate bosses without talking about workers and corporate employees. And what distinguishes each of them in each case is their relationship to a third factor. What distinguishes the few who own and the many who work for those who own, what distinguishes them is their relationship to this third factor, which is the means of production. That is, to the wealth, to the state power, to the land, the mines, the mills, the goods, the services. There are those who own things, and there are those who work for those who own things, who have nothing else, so they sell their labor power. That's most of us. That's what we got to do. We got to go find a job or a profession or something like that if we plan to pay the rent, whatever. Now, capital comes in two forms. There's both productive capital, that's the land, the mines, the mills, all that stuff, and then there's the material component of production. I mean, that is the material component of production I just mentioned. And then there's financial capital. The goal of the modern capitalist, the modern transnational corporation, the goal of that organization is not productive capital or productivity as such. The goal is financial accumulation. And if maximizing your financial communication means intensifying your productivity, they'll do it. If maximizing your financial accumulation means minimizing productivity, taking certain things out of production, deindustrializing whole areas, buying up all the public assets in Eastern Europe and then just selling off the assets and deindustrializing them and closing them because you don't want their steel industry to compete with yours. You don't want their mining industry to compete with yours. You don't want their agribusiness to compete with their collective farms to compete with your agribusiness. So you buy them up and then you put them out of business, which is what has been happening all over Europe. It's happening today now in Serbia, now that Serbia has the blessings of the free market capitalist democracy. David Broderick, former president of U.S. Steel, said it very nicely. I heard him once on TV. He said, U.S. Steel is not in the business of making steel. That was very smart. I came to the edge of my seat. I said, is he really going to say it? And you know what? He did. And then he didn't say, it's in the business of making a profit. He didn't say that. He said something better. He said, it's in the business of making the highest possible profit for its shareholders. That's what it's in the business of. That's what U.S. Steel is in the business of. That's what General Motors is. That's what General Electric is. That's what General Dynamics is. That's what all the generals are in the business of, making sure that those who have shall have yet more. The highest possible profit. One of the key instruments for this accumulation process is a convention known as money. I was taught when I was in school that money is a medium of exchange. It's a way we can deal and exchange goods and services. And that has a really nice, neutral sounding ring to it. Money is a medium of exchange. Money can be used for good or bad. You can use money to build a hospital or to bribe an official. You can use money to enhance with scholarships or corrupt or kill or whatever. Actually, on further reflection, I decided that money is not a neutral thing. Money is not an instrument for good or bad. Money itself, by its very nature, historically in a class society, becomes a means of abstracting, mobilizing, and accumulating wealth. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invented it. They wouldn't have put so much stock in it. They wouldn't be going after it so much. In the olden days, when wealth consisted principally of land, crops, herds, furs, silver plates, gold cups, jewelry, and such, you could accumulate just so much, and you can do just so much with it. But abstracted from material wealth, money becomes a very flexible, very powerful, very mobile tool for accumulation. In a world of rich and poor, there's nothing neutral about money. It's the same with technology. When they say technology is just a neutral instrument, you could use it for good, you could use it for bad. That's not true. Technology is developed within the framework of a social structure. Technology is developed by those who own and control technology, who have a lot of money. And they develop technologies of surveillance, they develop technologies of war, they develop technologies of self-promotion, of marketing. That's what they use technology for the most part. Cell phones are very tacky, I think. That's something we don't want to... I was listening to somebody who I consider to be the id of the right wing. You know, let's get Freudian about this. There's the superego that puts the gloss and maintains the hypocritical appearances, and there's the ego that kind of goes out and gets it and tries to justify it and all. And then there's the id, the raw, primitive truth. I was listening to the id of the right wing, Rush Limbaugh. Yeah. And he was saying, it's not a zero-sum game we have here in America. It's not a zero-sum game. When there's more for the big guys at the top, of which he is a multi-millionaire, he doesn't mention that. They never say that. They never come out and say, by the way, I'm one of those fat, greedy pigs that they talk about. He said, when there's more for them, there's also more for us. The pie gets bigger, we all get a bigger slice. It's not zero-sum. A rising tide lifts all boats. Well, you know, there's another saying, a rising tide sinks many boats, drowns many people. In fact, it can be zero-sum, and to some extent it is. And I'll show you in a minute why. Now, before we get any further into the discussion of capitalism, it's at this point that we hear about the entrepreneurial spirit. Well, what about the guy who goes out, he has an idea, and he develops a commodity, and he gets a market, and he hires people, and creates jobs. It's always said in that kind of nostalgic sing-song way, jobs, and makes a contribution to the community. You know, you could, by this time you're getting all moist-eyed, you know. And I always have to say, I'm not talking about those people. I'm not talking about mom and pop capitalism, okay? Lenin made the point. 5 million small businesses count for nothing. A few giant cartels count for everything. I'm talking about the people who have the muscle. I'm not talking about the squirrels who are dancing among the elephants and getting stomped out. 400 a week getting stomped out of business, small businesses, with others coming in. Of course, hope beats eternally. I'm talking about the elephants. I'm talking about those who are doing the stomping. I'm talking about the transnational monopoly finance capital reality, not the entrepreneurial mythology. So that's what we're talking about. And for them, it is, to some extent, zero-sum. Great wealth creates great poverty. There's not just an innocent juxtaposition. We always point out that juxtaposition. We always say, isn't it tragic? So much wealth right next to so much poverty here. Isn't this terrible? As if they're just sitting there in embarrassing juxtaposition. No. Great wealth causes great poverty. You can't have great wealth unless you have poverty. You can't have rich slaveholders living on these big plantations, living a life like that, unless you have impoverished slaves. You can't have the Lord born to the manor unless you have the serfs who do all that work for him. And you can't have great transnational corporations unless you have workers who work all their lives living from hand to mouth and who end up with a miserable little pension if they're lucky. Now, the wealthy class doesn't just sit there with the wealth. It translates its wealth into political power, into social control, and into cultural hegemony. In time, the ever-expanding wealth and the ever-expanding appetite for wealth goes abroad. It has to look for other places to carve out natural resources, to exploit even cheaper labor, especially when their own workers start putting all sorts of ridiculous, stupid, wasteful demands on you, like a living wage, a pension fund, vacations, occupational safety, consumer protections, environmental protections. When will it stop? What are they doing? Every dollar spent wasted on stupid things like that is one less dollar in my pocket. So I go to Indonesia. I go to Haiti, where I can pay people not $15 an hour, not $1 an hour, but $1 a day. That's where I go to. So they go abroad, and there too, it's zero sum. Empire brings great wealth to the investing class and great expense for the people of the imperial nation. The process of empire, in case you want to know, the process of empire is what is called imperialism. And imperialism is when the ruling interests of one country expropriate or exploit the land, the labor, the natural resources, the markets, and the capital and technology of another country. That's what imperialism is. So these ruling interests do the same to the people in these other places as they do to people here. The patricians pursue their far-off plunder, and we, the people, are also very much involved in empire in terms of its costs. They get the benefits, and we get the costs. We pay the taxes, and we pay the blood. The empire feeds off the republic. The empire has more power, more grandeur, more scope, more reach, more striking force than ever. It is one of the wonders of human history. And the republic has public hospitals that are closing, public schools that are closing, kids who haven't had one teacher in a term for years but have had seen 15 different substitutes in 3 months, schools that don't even have enough textbooks, schools where the roofs are leaking, housing so miserable that we have hundreds of thousands of homeless, beggary all over in an empire that's so ever rich. You're seeing it happen this very year. Dramatic instances of states and cities saying, we are going bankrupt. We cannot meet our budgets. We are in a state of crisis. We will have to cut back our human services. And meanwhile, $200 billion being spent over the $402 billion that's being spent on the military budget, over that $200 billion being spent on the war in Iraq, with fat billion-dollar contracts for Halliburton and Bechtel and 70 other U.S. corporations, and also access to a huge trove of oil worth about $3 to $4 trillion. And that's really one of the compelling reasons why the U.S. rulers suddenly feel so compelled to bring democracy and electricity and running water to Iraq. First you destroy the electricity and running water, you bomb their utilities, and then you say, love me, I'm going to bring you electricity and running water. Not this year, but next year, whenever. Okay. So whenever. The plutocracy in this country also operates on the assumption that the public treasury is at its disposal. So while you have a ruling class propaganda that says government is the cause of all your problems, stop running to government for a handout, do self-reliance, it's the free market that gives you your prosperity, while you have them saying that, these same people are going to government, going to the public treasury, and they're pulling out billions of dollars in equity subsidies, loan guarantees, export subsidies, research and development assistance, production loss compensations, tax write. If mom and pop go out of business, they don't get bailouts. They don't get bailouts from the federal government. But if Chrysler threatens to go out of business, what happens? Uncle Sam comes with hundreds of millions of dollars to help him out. Tax write-offs, grants and aids. Hundreds of billions of dollars every year go from the U.S. taxpayer to the Fortune 500. To them that have shall be given. To them that have not shall be taken even what little that they have. And the plutocrats operate on the assumption that the rest of us should learn to stand on our own feet and stop running to the government. Plutocracy also does not look with favor on the public sector. If you develop a public sector of services or one of production, which we're not allowed to do in this country, the government can't go directly into market production. It's just simply not allowed. I mean, there are laws against all that. But building public housing, building public health services, you are creating jobs, you're creating tax base, you get revenue back, you're creating services, you're answering human needs, and these plutocrats aren't making a penny on it. That's like Tony Soprano finding out all these new restaurants have opened up right in his neighborhood, and he doesn't get any take on it. And so they hate the public sector. The public sector demonstrates that you can actually have human needs taken care of, human production, all that sort of thing, human services, and these guys don't make a penny. And so the goal is to privatize this entire public sector, because then we get our take. And their take makes Tony Soprano look like a piker, right? What does he deal with? Thousands of dollars. We're talking about millions and billions of dollars here. The plutocrats are also good, like Tony is. They're good at dealing with and roughing up and beating up on those who can't defend themselves. The low income, the disabled. I'll tell you something else they're good at beating up on that can't defend itself. That's the environment. The environment can't defend itself. We have to defend it. And they're really good at it. They're really good. They see the environment. They see whatever natural resources are left. They see that as they have a right to whatever those natural resources are there. They have a right to get it and use them as they want, when they want it, to maximize profit, quick cash profits, and the like. Another device they have is deficit spending. This is how the plutocracy uses our otherwise democratic government in the most undemocratic ways. It's a myth. It's a myth that right-wingers are fiscal conservatives. No one's a bigger, wilder spender than the reactionaries who are in power now. Ronald Reagan tripled the national debt from $800 billion to $2.3 trillion by the time he got out. George Bush added an additional $2 trillion to the national debt. Clinton reduced the debt somewhat and actually produced a surplus in his last two budgets. No deficit. What is a deficit? A deficit is when the government spends more money than it takes in revenues. How can it do that? It does that by borrowing from people who have lots of money. Rich creditors, banks, financial institutions, and the like, floating government bonds. The national debt is the accumulation of these yearly deficits. Deficits and debts accomplish several things for rich conservatives. First, the debt is a source of safe investment and income for the creditor class. The bonds, those U.S. bonds you buy, you have the full faith and credit of the federal government behind them. It's a safe investment. And yet one of the things with people with billions of dollars is, what do they do with it? What do I put it into? Where can I put it, you know? That it'll be safe, or that it'll make me return, like. The second thing is that deficits and debts represent an upward redistribution of income from the millions who work to the rich investors. Because what happens is these investors lend billions of dollars every year to the U.S. government, and we, the people, the taxpayers, have to pay them back at interest that accumulates and accumulates and accumulates and grows. So we're borrowing from the people. The U.S. government is borrowing from the people who they should be taxing. Instead, they cut their taxes, and then they borrow money from them that we then have to pay them. So more and more of our federal budget is being privatized. That's the third function of debt and deficit. That in effect, you're privatizing the federal budget. A larger chunk of it is going every year to pay off rich creditors. Not for schools, not for hospitals, not for education, not for environmental protection, not for the Forest Service, not for rural electrification, not for housing, blah, blah. No, it's going to pay off rich creditors. The larger the debt, the larger the portion of your tax dollars that goes to the creditors. And fourth, finally, these huge deficits, $500 billion in George W. Bush's budget this year, $500 billion. These huge deficits become an excuse to cut the public sector services. We can't afford all these other silly luxury things like aid to disabled children, right? Our governor right here, Muscles, didn't he just do that? His first act as governor of California was to cut the program to disabled children. We just, oh, I'm sorry, but we just have to do it. Well, through much of history, then, the leaders of a capitalist state have been concerned with three things. First, to extract surplus value from the labor of the people, extract wealth, all the things I've just been saying, from the many, putting it in the coffers of the few. This whole process I'm describing, loan guarantees, export subsidies, well, that's all part of capital accumulation. Second function of the state is to protect that entire system of accumulation and upward redistribution. Keep the entire system of class control and class exploitation intact, suppress resistance and dissident elements, and when that becomes too difficult, then grant concessions, incorporate changes into a new synthesis that helps the overall capitalist system to remain intact, but with a slightly more equitable distribution of wages and wealth. That's not class oppression, that's called class struggle, when people fight back and they make certain gains, and the guys at the top say, whoa, this is really getting hot, we better give in on this, better give in on that. The second function, though, the systemic function of systemically maintaining this system of expropriation, is achieved with symbolic manipulation, informational control. I have water here already. Police state repression, control of the law and the courts and other auxiliary institutions. There's a third function that the capitalist state has, and this is the one I find very interesting because I think it's really being overlooked by the reactionaries who are in power today. They're called conservatives. I don't get it. Why? A conservative, if someone, is someone who does not want any kind of change because he doesn't want any infringement on his powers and his privileges. These guys want change all over the place. They call them reforms, but they want rollbacks. They're changing everything. They want to get rid of Social Security. They want to get rid of environmental controls, the Clean Air Act, the Fresh Air. He's undermining the wetlands bills. He's undermining through executive orders, through reinterpretations. He's going at it one way or the other. They're rolling it all back. They learned from the Newt Gingrich days that if you try to do it in all one fell swoop, a Republican revolution, wipe it all out, yay, that can backfire. And even among your own Republicans, there are people who say, whoa, wait a minute, I like fresh air, clean air. And Gingrich had that happen. He had these ranchers writing in and say, what are you doing to the environment, you crazy jackass? So now what they do it is by peace, 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 peace. But they're reactionaries, that's what they are. And these reactionaries have forgotten the third function. And that is, the third function of the capitalist state is to protect the owning class from itself, to protect it from its own avarice, to see that the parasite doesn't destroy the very organism upon which it battens. The capitalist state must keep the capitalist class from devouring itself. And we see that was happening with Enron, WorldCom, Halliburton, Harkin. The activist element of the investor class literally expropriating not only taxpayers and workers, but other investors. So, hey, why worry about producing cars and refrigerators? Then you got to worry about trying to sell them and this and that and make a profit. Let's just go where the money is. Just tap into streams of money. Let's go. Who has money? Investors, pension funds, 401ks, all this stuff. Let's go and steal money from them. And they have been caught plundering investor income, billions of dollars. Many of these investors, of course, are small investors too, life pensions and all that. And this is a real crime. I mean, this is really now being looked at. And some of these guys are going to have to do hours of community service. I mean, I'm getting really tough here, boy. I mean, you think I'm kidding. Look at Argentina. Do you remember what happened in Argentina a few years ago? I mean, I thought there was a case of the failure of the capitalist state to protect itself against capitalism. All of the people's pensions and monies and funds and everything, Argentina, this investor class went in there and stole. You don't understand, you're dealing with people who are insatiable. You're dealing with people who are absolutely ruthless. We are dealing with addicts. It's not true that coke or heroin is the worst addiction in America, or cigarettes or alcohol. The worst addiction, the most crippling, the most damaging addiction is wealth. These people are just out of control. They just want more and more and more. And they're not unlike the ruling classes of all history. If the ruling classes of all history have ever wanted anything, there's only one thing they've ever wanted, and that's everything. They want all the lands, all the choice crops, all the herds, all the rich mineral deposits. They want control of all the labor, all the markets. They want all the civilities and comforts and luxuries of civil society while paying none of the costs. They want everything. And then when they got everything, they want still more. They want gold chalices to drink out of. They want $1,000 bills to light their cigars. They want, of course, the ruling class has learned since the days of the robber baron, they're not as crass and crude about it. But they are just as ruthless in their dedication to this accumulation. And I think that might be the crucial difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. That is, the Democrats are a capitalist party. They will tell you that. They're not so, they're capitalists. But they are different in that they do see this third function as important, that the state does have to occasionally rein in the avarice of the ruling class. So capital, the other thing that capital has to do is it needs to continually expand, and now on a global level. Ownership of the world's water supplies is next. A source of investment, ownership, and profit. A source of creating scarcity. A source of creating a new private market and more profits. Get people to work harder and harder so they have to pay a large chunk of their modest incomes for water. for water. So corporate capitalism moves restlessly into all corners of the world, destroying happy communities in the Philippines, in the Amazon, in Africa, in the United States for fast buck plunder. In the Philippines, you have these free business zones. They'll go into islands and communities where people have orchards and groves and fish and plant and have been living there for who knows how many centuries and living a good life, and they come in, drive these people off the land with these phony deeds, and then just harvest all the timber that's there. In tropical areas can't survive, that kind of thing. It turns it into a wasteland, worse for the ecology, worse for the air, worse for that. These people are driven off into the shanty towns, and there you got the free market, transnational corporate free market doing its thing, pursuing its profits, and destroying human lives, human communities, ways of life, and the environment. So this empire is not an end in itself. This empire, I wrote a book called Against Empire, and when it came out a few years ago, people said, empire? Well, Parenti, boy, you really, boy, overstating it again. But I noticed that you got people from the Hoover Institute. You got people from the Hoover Institute who are writing books called Empire. You've got these right-wing pundits who overpopulate our media, are all of them talking about, we're an empire, and we ought to get used to it and face up to it, and we got to start acting like an empire, and we got to maintain our credibility as an empire, and all this. Well, what is this empire for? This empire is not an end in itself. It's an instrument, as the Roman Empire was, as the British Empire was, as the Spanish Empire was. It's an instrument for extracting and grabbing wealth. It's an instrument of imperialism. So Max Weber was a bourgeois conservative social theorist, a non-Marxist. I give you a quote of his. He wrote this in about 1912. The question is, how are freedom and democracy in the long run at all possible under the domination of highly developed capitalism? That question, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, that question is still with us. How to defend and advance a political economic democracy in the face of corporate economic domination. Well, there exists not only class oppression, but class struggle. The many have been fighting back. Democracy is a wonderful invention by the people of history to protect themselves from the oppressions and impoverishment caused by wealth and by the abuses of wealth. But democracy is more than just its electoral and representational procedures. It has a substance and a content. Oh, they'll give you the procedures. We can have elections for dog catcher, elections for president, elections for this, elections for assembly, elections for school board, elections all over the place. But democracy's got to be something more than just government of the people. It's got to be government for the people, for their needs, for their socio-economic well-being, for it to be a real democracy. And today's rulers keep the appearance of democracy while undoing the substance and subverting the substance, while undoing the economic gains that we have won over the past century. And then when the people try to organize and resist this rollback, then they launch attacks against our very democratic rights. That when we try to protect our standard of living, our economic democracy, and to do that, we use our political democracy. They then attack our political democracy and our political rights. Or George Bush summed it up in his inimitable way. He said, it sure would be a lot easier to govern if it was a dictatorship. And that's what they seem to be moving toward. Well, don't think for a moment that our reactionary rulers don't care what we think. That is their most important concern. Oh, do they care? Oh, are they watching? Oh, do they try to keep us convinced of their lies? They're trying to get in our heads all the time, getting into our heads. They're trying to close our mouths all the time, to wave the flag in our faces, to manipulate and pretend, to keep the boys and girls fighting and dying in some land which most of those kids couldn't have even found on a map last year. To some extent, ladies and gentlemen, to some extent, all regimes, all governments ultimately rest on public opinion. And when that opinion shifts and when support declines, then those rulers have to backpedal. They have to hide their arrogance. They have to pretend that they share our outrage and our concerns, and they're as concerned as any of you, I swear. And to keep that pretense credible, they have to take actions and make concessions that they don't want to make at all. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to keep pressuring, agitating, getting our opinion out there at two levels. One, horizontally, building our base wider and wider, and two, impacting vertically upon them and letting them know how we feel and what we feel. When the people are ready to lead, the leaders will eventually follow. Thank you, brothers and sisters.
Thank you, Michael Parenti. We've just heard I guess it's the fourth program of this General Assembly brought to you by the Unitarian Universalists for a Just Economic Community. We've had several thousand people attend our programs at this GA and hear some of the most informed people in our nation speak to you. This is the labor of a small organization with one staff person run by volunteers, an organization that has helped create the statement of conscience on economic globalization and its consequences, that has brought a workers' bill of rights and other statements of conscience over the years, and has tried to give UU congregations curriculum so that they can study. Yes, there will be a question and answer period, I've been reminded, with Michael in just a few moments. There will be time, Michael. Be sure of that. We have led the efforts to educate UUs about economic globalization and have taken people and organized people to go down to Miami to the FTAA. We have taken people to Mexico to see the effects on human beings of economic globalization, corporate globalization. And we need to have your support to continue this work. You will find on your chairs either the call with a pink cover that's got an application for membership, or this brochure. And we would urge and ask you to please help support UUs for a Just Economic Community at this critical time. You've just heard how critical it is, and it's going to get even worse, unfortunately, as the empire continues its deeds of death and destruction and exploitation. So now we'll go to Michael for questions. Thank you very much. There's a microphone here in the center. You going to test?
That's what I was going to say. There's a microphone here. If you can line up, we can record your question for possible broadcast. Thank you.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of
That's it. We won't have time for too many more after that, I think. Yeah, right.
I wonder if you could talk about the role of the defense industry in transferring wealth from the public sector to the private sector.
You just did it. That's what its goal is. Defense spending is marvelous. I mean, if you're a military contractor, look what you got. You have non-competitive bidding, most cases. So the price I name is the price the government gives me. You have a predetermined market, a guaranteed market. Unlike the auto manufacturer, he's got to go out and worry about selling his cars, those ecological disasters known as cars, or refrigerator or TVs, you got to sell them. This guy's got it already, it's already bought before he's even making them. The Pentagon's going to take every one of these planes, every one of these things. You get research and development from the government. You get equity. McDonald, I mean, it's multi-billion-dollar, you know, they built a factory. What they'll tell you, oh, we invested $10 million in and we made $1 million a year profit, 10%. They didn't tell you, they didn't tell you that in fact the real capital. No, they'll say the thing. I forget it. I don't want to give you that example because I'd have to start making up the figures. But I mean, the Pentagon will give them the land and the factory and pay for almost all the research and development. So McDonnell Aircraft or whoever, McDouglas, what am I? What? Boeing, all of them, all the pigs. Yeah, right. They're really getting so incredibly subsidized. There's nothing like it. The other thing that defense spending has, it's got a built-in obsolescence. You know, it's infinite. I mean, how prepared is preparedness? I mean, when are you fully prepared? Now we find out that the $450 billion we're spending every year on the military doesn't cover wars. Oh no, that's the peacetime military. What? That's for, pension funds and stuff, maneuvers and stuff. But they need I forgot what I was going to say. Okay. They need extra billions for the wars. That's exactly what happened with Iraq. They've gone and spent an extra $100 billion now to fight the wars. Something to look forward to. Your tax dollars at work, your future tax dollars at work, not just the ones now, but the ones later. Yes, Ms.
Okay. I'm also a member of WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Wait, could I just add one last thing to that? The function then is, as far as the question of the privatization of the economy with defense spending, it's the most it's the biggest stream, the most profitable source of government contracts and profit, corporate profit. That's what defense spending is. That's why it's so untouchable. Not because it keeps you safe and all that. It's because it keeps them super rich. Yeah.
Okay, I am a member of WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and one of our very big projects
I think it's a good organization.
Challenging corporate abuses, corporate power, and abolishing corporate personhood. They are persons, but they're psychopaths. I will happily give you a flyer. Are you a member of WILF?
I've given talks at WILF organizations, but no, I'm not a member of WILF. I thought it was women only. Yeah.
All right. Yes, my name is Strider. Adam Smith was the founding philosophical father of capitalism, and in 1759, in Moral Sentiments, he wrote, "The purpose of government is to protect wealth. Its very end is to defend the rich against the poor." The next, prior to him, was John Locke, who said, "Anything not being exploited for profit is wasteland, and is therefore the property of anyone who wants to go and take it from those who are not properly exploiting it." What we have in the last 50 years is the very conscious creation of scarcity. It happened with the Mining Act in the 19th century and with the railroads' theft of 150 million acres, and now the airwaves and the water. But it used to be just a natural concomitant. Now it is very...
Stop him. Why is that?
It's class oppression, and I would like to speak about that. I've worked all my life, and I'd like to speak for another 15 seconds.
Go ahead.
All right. The the theft of the commons of the whole world has been absolutely conscious policy for the last 50 years to create scarcity. Could you address that as being a known and conscious policy right now? Thank you.
Yeah, I dealt with some of that in the very opening part of my... Are you listening?
Yes. Yes.
I dealt with some of that in the opening part of my talk. I noticed you came in late and you may have missed that. But we did talk about the function of land and labor and how these things are expropriated. And you gave some a very telling quote by Adam Smith and some good information on that. And it's not just the last 50 years, but of course in the last 50 years the process has intensified and it's becoming more in crisis and more telling and more costly, to the point where the whole planet's ecology is now at risk.
Thank you.
One of the insidious strengths of capitalism is that many of us do very well, even though we start from very poor origins, such as Bill Gates or Rush Limbaugh. Could you talk about that?
Bill Gates started from poor origins?
He wasn't.
His father's a billionaire.
Okay, well, others do, though.
Well, I don't know what the point is. The point is that there are people who make great fortunes. Yeah, that's true. Generally in an advanced, mature capitalist society, making a great fortune is a rare exception. Bill Gates, I mean, you can name them on one or two hands. The surest way to gain wealth in a capitalist society is to have the foresight, the resourcefulness, and the intelligence and creativity to pick the right parents at birth. That really is the best way. There's very little really transporting from one class to another. I mean, you might go, my father was a blue-collar Italian-American worker in New York, and I was a street kid in New York City, and I didn't go to college after high school, not for a while. I worked and all that. Okay, so I was lucky because I was at a certain stage where the economy was expanding, universities were expanding, there was a stipend, a fellowship. I don't see that, though. I don't see that I don't see it as a manifestation of the beneficence of capitalism, one. I don't see it as a demonstration of the individual greatness and accomplishment of this present person. I'm a self-made man. That's baloney. There's no such thing as a self-made man. I wouldn't have been able to go anywhere if it wasn't for generations of people whose names I don't even know, who fought for the principle of public education. That's how I went to school, because I got public education. And that was true. I went to City College of New York. And even when I went to Yale for my PhD, it was on stipends and fellowships, because there were people who fought for having stipends and fellowships for needy students. Those are all socialist principles. Those are all socialist reasons. So rather than saying, yeah, my pop was poor and all, and look at me today, unemployed academic, eh? I call myself a recovering academic. I've been kicked out of some of the best universities in America for my political activities. Okay. Look, I meant to tell the people, we have, what, 20, how much time is left? Oh, till 4:30. Oh, there was a gentleman who sat down who was ahead of you guys. If you want to, he should come back up here. Come on up. Then. And I'm going to sign books. My copies of my book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, The People's History of Ancient Rome, are out there. If you want a read, if you really, I mean, I loved writing that book. It's the only book I ever wrote where I was unhappy when I finished it. I wanted to keep going. It's a fascinating period. It's really a fascinating time. Those Romans really knew how to do it. I mean, it was really pretty obvious. I mean, the killings, the this, the that, lots of sex and violence in the book. So, but mostly what I discovered is that ancient history is not so ancient, and that there are very compelling and intriguing parallels. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm the spouse of a Chilean refugee who, for the last 25 years, has every day, probably given me this theoretical framework that you presented nice and succinctly today of the capitalist society and that we're an empire.
Well, I would say the first month or two, consider yourself lucky, but every day for the last 20 years, Mom,
yes,
I mean, that's...
I'm saying that on purpose.
Oh, okay.
And there's a degree of depression.
Well, thanks for staying for the whole talk. I thought you would have gotten up and run out, yeah.
There's a degree of depression and hopelessness because of that. Is there something in history that gives you hope in terms of the class struggle against the capitalist society?
Well, yeah, I mean, gains have been won. I mean, even in our own time, very important gains have been won. Don't forget, in 1900, the U.S. was a third world nation, half a century before the term was invented. We had mass unemployment, mass poverty. We had diphtheria and tuberculosis epidemics in the cities. We had child labor, children in factories working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. We had, to say nothing's changed, it's always the same, it isn't quite right. I mean, sometimes the struggle does replicate itself, but at a different level. We had the worst and earliest form of class oppression in this society. That's called slavery, which was abolished. Slavery still exists. There's about 27 million men, women, and children who are being held in peonage or debt bondage or outright servitude. You folks should not get online. We're not going to. We only got about 5 or 10 minutes more, so I don't think it's going to happen. But so I would say, yeah. Yeah, sometimes some things get worse, but other things do get better, and the people have made important democratic gains, and we mustn't forget that, and we mustn't lose those gains. Their goal is to get us back to 1900. If they, in their heart of hearts, they want us back to an America where there was no labor unions, no public services to speak of, no public protections and consumer protections, none of that. They wanted it where they had it all, and we were just the peons who lined up begging for jobs and working 60, 70-hour weeks. So things have gotten better to that extent.
I'm a beneficiary of the New Deal rescuing public education in New York. And I was able to attend CCNY tuition-free because of B+ average on the Regents examinations. And then the GI Bill of Rights got me to get my bachelor's and my master's degree and start a family. And I think it's the best investment the government ever made. But my question is, Benito Mussolini was quoted in Harper's Magazine as saying, redefining fascism as corporatism, the merger of government and corporations. Do you think we're on that track?
Mussolini's corporatism was more than the merger of corporations and state. The corporate, it meant the incorporation of the entire population. There were corporate components, workers, peasants, middle class, and all. It's another whole thing. That's a playing around with the term. Fascism is a false revolution. We use the term fascism to mean Pinochet, oppressors, right-wingers who support the state. But fascism was a particular invention of the ruling class. It projects a false populism. It projects a mass populism. And in that sense, you're getting some of that from this class today. They project this false populism that we're for you folks. It's these liberal elites who try to run everything. It's these latte-sipping hoity-toits, and we're for you regular folk here, you know. And George Bush gets up and he says, Americans, I heard his ad on TV, he said, Americans are hard-working people. He just gets his Texas accent gets thicker, and we're out there and we're doing it, you know. So they try to affect, because they know that a lot of people don't vote the issues. They vote against their own interests. They vote their values. And they say, we're the guys you want. We're the church-going ones. We're the ones who believe in marriage and the sanctity of marriage. Rush Limbaugh. He loves marriage. He just got his third divorce. He's going to get married a fourth time. He loves marriage. He believes in marriage. He's going to keep doing it until he gets it right, you know. I mean, they're the biggest hypocrites. They're no more pristine in their personal lives than we are. But this is the hypocritical veneer they put out there. You know, George Bush never read a book in his life. They like him for that. That's what they, you know, they don't quite say that, but regular guy and all that sort of thing. So in that sense, they do make mass appeals in order, and they do conjure up irrelevant enemies. They say the people who are doing this to you are the immigrants, or the liberals, the media elites. What a joke! They own the media, and the like. And that's what Hitler did. That's what fascism was. It's a way of mobilizing and misdirecting mass sentiment, and with a revolutionary aura. You're saying we need a revolution, but you give them a false revolution. There's no change in the class structure except downward. You destroy labor unions. That when Hitler came in, he cut wages in half, by half. I mean, the conditions for the Germans went from bad to worse. Increased military spending, privatized things. Does any of this sound familiar? And he conjured up these irrelevant enemies, saying it was the trade unionists, the communists, the Jews, the Jewish bankers. You know, they put in a little bit of anti-capitalism, but they were the Jewish bankers, not the bankers. And behind all this were the Jews and the communists and that like. So that's what fascism is. It's not just dictatorship. It's a manipulation. And Mussolini did the same thing. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for a chance to get a word in. Just really appreciate what you've said today. I just wondered if you'd speak to the whole issue of the atom. You know, Einstein spoke his words about everything changing but our way of thinking and what the outlook is, and how this has been surrounded by both secrecy and also a lot of psychological denial. I mean, you know, we don't want to think about it, but it is...
Think about what? The atom?
The whole issue of atomic weapons and the military and what they're now up to. I mean, it's like the Cold War is all on again as far as this administration goes. What do you think of what's happening that way?
Well, that's part of the empire's plan to become so totally invincible, and you do that by controlling war from outer space, by building ultimate weapons, the ultimate weapons, and they're using weapons. They use them in against Serbia and in Kosovo, depleted uranium, horrible effect. They used them in the Gulf War in '91, and they're using them again now in Iraq, depleted uranium weapons. They are developing new nuclear weapons. It's all part of this same, what their values are. All their money, all their inventiveness, all their science goes into what? Surveillance and destruction. What is it? Well, think of all the other things. Name the great military governmental leaders that gave us all. They didn't do it. It came from the people. Everything else came from the people. Everything else. You want to name it? Conservation, public education, workers' rights, women's rights, civil liberties. All that came from ordinary people fighting and agitating. These guys up there never offered or came up with one of those things at all. Their job was to resist those things, ignore them, try to repress them, and then finally make grudging concessions when they had to. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a little to the position of people like myself and yourself, and I suspect a lot of us in this room, that we're not the poorest of the poor. We have the resources to drive across the state or fly across the country to come here, but at the same time we don't have $1 million to drop on campaign contributions. We don't really have the freedom to set our own course because we are still working, a working week, even if we're working at a nice job. I mean, what are we? Are we the oppressors or are we the oppressed? Where do we stand?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I really don't. I don't understand that question. Of course we're oppressed. Yeah, so people live well. You can live well. It's not the class you come from, and it's the class you identify with. and it's the values you want to pursue. And those values are being destroyed and violated. Do you want a clean and livable environment? Then you're one of the oppressed, because those guys are sticking it up you one side and back down the other. Every time you go out there and take a breath of air, you're the oppressed, okay? Do you want clean and edible food that's not full with pesticides and everything else? Then you're one of the oppressed. Do you want to work like a dog all the time and not have time to recreation, or live in a community where there's some civility and safety? If you want the latter, then you're the oppressed, of course. Of course we're oppressed. Now, that doesn't mean, oppressed does not necessarily mean you're just sitting on the corner with a cup in your hand. There are all sorts of forms. And so this is not, we're not here just to help the poor unfortunates who are lower in the income scale than us. We're here also to fight for our own interests. Yeah.
I was interested, you talked about government deficits or ballooning government deficits as a tool for creating safe investments in terms of treasury bills, a larger treasury debt. I wonder if you could speak to the fact that a lot of
relatively safe, because nothing's really safe, because the government can
full faith and credit, you know.
Yeah.
The fact that a lot, I think the majority of U.S. government bonds are held in other countries, in fact, a huge proportion in China. So I'm curious about that, how you see that in the framework you're talking about.
Well, that there are ruling class elements all over the world. It's internationalized, yeah. Or with deficit trade, a lot of that could be just a way of making up the deficit, that these countries will take these dollars, you know, in exchange.
Yeah, China's
they don't take bonds. They take U.S. dollars. They get reserves of immense reserves of dollars. Are you sure bonds? That's usually just done. You know, the Saudi family owns. The Saudi family owns a lot more U.S. bonds than all of us in this room put together, and then another 10 other rooms. 1,000 other rooms. Yeah. We have to. All right, make these the last two questions. Even though I told you not to get up, I told you not to get up and keep your seat. Quick question. Quick answer to it.
I'm sorry, it isn't really a question. Somebody asked a little while ago, what can they do? And we had a lady from WILPF speaking. I'm Michael Greenman with the UUJEC and the First UU Church of Columbus, Ohio. There's an article in the Call about the fact that we had Ward Morehouse, the founder of POCLAD, in our community a few months ago. We've started a group in the Unitarian Churches network, which we refer to as Citizens for Democracy and Ending Corporate Rule. And we're trying to pull together Unitarian congregations as activist groups to address that on a local issue in their communities.
Okay, well, that's exactly what UUJEC is also trying to do, isn't it? So I hope you coordinate and work together.
No, I said I'm
okay, right,
part
good.
of that. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, see the man and get his leaflet if you are interested, please.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Could you just succinctly state a few points of what you would see a more desirable social, political, and economic order to be?
Oh, listen to that. I think you can get that from what I've just said, an order where most of the major industries would be publicly owned and be used for, not for profit, but for development, a society in which we would cut our military budget. In Against Empire and in Democracy for the Few, I have at the end, a whole section. It's so obvious the things we want. Better environmental protections and regulations, stronger labor unions, public ownership of these giant corporations, the end of corporate personhood would be certainly true, limiting them, drastic cuts in military spending with an eye to totally eliminating the military except for minimal defenses. And you can go on and on. What? Living wage, all those things, surely. Surely you know. No, the problem is not what we would do. We all know what we would do. Stop this crazy space station program going to Mars. How about paying attention to Earth and all that? The question is, how do we get them to do it? And that's what we got to keep struggling for. I think.
Thank you, Michael, very much for all the analysis you've done for so many years and the advocacy work. It's fantastic and a source of inspiration. Please go out and purchase a book and join our organization, UUs for Just Economic Community. Thanks.